Hey guys, tonight we embark on a rather peculiar journey, a gentle drift back in time to an era often romanticized yet fraught with silent peril. We're going to explore the quiet, unacknowledged misery of life in the Tudor court, specifically through the eyes of a lady-in-waiting. So dim the lights, perhaps wrap yourself in a soft blanket and let the gentle hum of history lull you into a state of deep relaxation. As you settle deeper into the quiet of this evening, perhaps consider a gentle tap on the subscribe button and a soft like on the video. Only, of course, if these historical whispers find a welcome place in your thoughts. And feel free to share a quiet hello in the comments below, letting us know where you're drifting from tonight. Now imagine yourself, for a quiet moment, transported back to the opulent yet often chilling halls of the Tudor court. When we think of a lady-in-waiting, our minds might conjure images of velvet gowns, sparkling jewels, and whispered secrets amongst the powerful. It sounds on the surface like a life of privilege, a coveted position within the glittering orbit of royalty. But in truth, for many, it was a quieter, softer, more polite nightmare. A slow, insidious decline, dressed in the finest silks, powdered with rose water to hide the rot, festering beneath the surface. The illusion was one of elegance and undeniable importance, a close connection to the very heart of power. The grim reality, however, was a relentless servitude, a life where every breath, every gesture was scrutinized, and every comfort was a rare, fleeting luxury. You were not there to shine, but to reflect, and often to absorb the darker moods of those around you. Your days would be an endless performance of unspoken demands and constant unspoken pressure. You were expected to smile even when your stomach gnawed with hunger, a polite ache that no one acknowledged. You would learn to flirt disingenuously with courtiers whose intentions were rarely honorable, and always to stand perfectly still for hours on end, your spine aching, your feet screaming in protest, your face fixed in an expression of attentive, beatific calm. No matter the physical pain, no matter the mental exhaustion you simply endured, you were in constant orbit around a queen who held your entire future, your reputation, and quite possibly your very life in her gaze. She could ruin you effortlessly with a glance. And the chilling, ever-present thought was that, eventually, she probably will. The purpose of our journey tonight is not to sensationalize, but rather to gently unravel this historical misery, laying bare the silent suffering that often underpinned what appeared to be a life of grandeur, making it perfectly suitable for an evening of quiet contemplation and perhaps a drift into sleep. We will explore the subtle indignities, the profound physical discomforts, and the pervasive anxieties that defined the daily existence of these women who, despite their proximity to power, were often little more than pawns in a much larger, much more dangerous game. After what likely felt like an interminable journey, perhaps weeks spent on a jolting coach, your arrival at Henry VIII's royal court would finally mark the culmination of years of meticulous training. Every lesson in deportment, every stitch of embroidery, every carefully chosen word in Latin or French had led you here. You had been schooled in the delicate art of courtly grace and the subtle dance of manners and presentation. Now you were assigned to serve his queen in honor, whispered about in hushed tones in the manor houses of England. The very air around the palace seemed to hum with anticipation, with the promise of a glorious new chapter in your life, far from the quiet confines of your childhood home. But almost immediately that idealized vision would begin to fray. Your presence, you would quickly realize, was not for your own distinction, not for any unique brilliance or charm you possessed. No, you were here because your family, while certainly noble, was just noble enough to be useful. A convenient connection, a name that could be added to a list, and crucially, just powerless enough to be ignored. You were in essence reduced to human furniture. A decorative, breathing, perhaps even elegant piece of furniture, yes, but furniture nonetheless. The grand title of lady-in-waiting would swiftly reveal itself as a profound misnomer. You were in the uncomfortable truth of it, a glorified servant with expensive sleeves. The silk and velvet were merely the uniform of your new unacknowledged servitude. The palace itself, a sprawling monumental edifice of stone, would likely strike you not as a grand welcoming haven, but as an enormous cold maze. Its vast halls echoed with the sounds of 1,000 restless feet, yet remained eerily silent in their overarching atmosphere. You would feel almost instantly the bite of stone-cold drafts that snaked through corridors and under massive ill-fitting doors, a constant chilling reminder of the building's formidable age and less-than-modern comforts. This was a place governed by a labyrinthine set of unspoken rules, a silent code of conduct that absolutely no one would bother to explain to a newcomer like yourself. You were expected to divine them, to absorb them through quiet observation, a trial-by-fire immersion into the subtle nuances of courtly life where a misstep could have disproportionate consequences. Your initial naive optimism, that bright, innocent spark you carried from your family home, that quiet excitement for a life of purpose and proximity to power would be quietly destroyed within the week. It wouldn't be a dramatic collapse, no sudden crushing revelation. Instead, it would be a slow, steady erosion, a quiet chipping away at your spirit, like water persistently wearing down stone. Perhaps your first encounter would set the tone, a subtle but unmistakable welcome to this new reality. You might approach a senior lady, her face etched with a perpetual expression like soured milk, her lips thin and unyielding. You might ask a simple, perfectly reasonable question, where to find the linen stores or when you would be presented to the queen. And in return, you would be met with nothing but a dismissive glance, a curt gesture, and a sharp, stinging shush delivered with the disdain one might reserve for a troublesome child. You, a lady of noble birth, would be treated as little more than an inconvenience, an irritating presence disrupting the carefully orchestrated silence of the court. This subtle, immediate diminishment of your person, this quiet assertion of your utter insignificance, would be one of the very first lessons in your new life. You were not here to be heard, but to observe and to wait. Your first taste of true courtly discomfort would come almost immediately upon arrival, before you'd even had a moment to catch your breath or unpack the few treasured items you carried from home. Your room, you would quickly discover, was not a private sanctuary, but a shared space, a cramped, often dark enclosure the size of a livestock stall. Imagine for a moment the intimate confines, the stale air. The low ceiling would press down a constant, subtle reminder of your diminished status, while the single drafty window offered little in the way of fresh air, serving more as a conduit for the palace's pervasive chill than a source of light or ventilation. And then there were your 3 roommates, senior ladies perhaps, or those who had merely arrived a few weeks before you, their faces often set in expressions of silent, unrelenting judgment, their eyes following your every tentative movement. Their presence would hang heavy in the air, a constant, unspoken evaluation. Your assigned bed, you'd quickly learn, was closest to the chamber pot, a dubious perk indeed, perhaps the only one that was not infested with visible lice. A small, uncelebrated victory, perhaps, but one that spoke volumes about the court's true standards of comfort and hygiene. There would be no time to unpack, no moment for rest after your long journey. Instead, you would be immediately stripped by a bored maid, her movements brusque and indifferent. She might mutter under her breath a low, indistinct grumble about fleas and sin, as if your very presence brought with it these earthly afflictions. You would be doused with what was laughably described as cleansing water, but which likely smelled more of stale onions and cheap vinegar than any refreshing rose. Then an ill-fitting gown would be thrust upon you, too tight in the bodice, constricting your lungs with every shallow breath and too loose at the waist, creating an ungainly silhouette. When you dared to voice a quiet discomfort, the maid would simply shrug, pulling at the fabric, declaring with an air of finality that it will do for now. This was not about your comfort. It was about your immediate presentation. The process of dressing was less about adorning yourself and more about a forced physical conformity. Your ribs would scream as the corsetry was tightened, cinching your waist to an unnatural degree, but you would not utter a sound. Your own comfort was irrelevant. Your shoes, often hard and unforgiving, would replace your traveling boots designed not for walking, but for a delicate, restricted shuffle. Your hair, previously your own, would be aggressively styled, pulled and pinned and braided, a process designed not for beauty, but for submission, rendering it stiff and immobile. Finally, you would be powdered until your skin felt tight and dry, and you smelled like a trampled rose, an artificial sweetness designed to mask the underlying musk of many unwashed bodies. The entire sensation was less like being dressed for a grand event, and more like being prepared for an auction rather than a coronation, your body transformed into a canvas or perhaps an exhibit. The layers of your new uniform served not only as clothing, but as a complex system of constraint and performance. Beneath it all, a linen shift, perhaps not been properly washed in weeks, would cling uncomfortably, smelling faintly of mildew and something else, something vaguely unpleasant. Then came the stays, the corsetry. The true violence of it was immediately evident as they were tightened, laced ever tighter until you can't breathe properly. The maids, with their weary pragmatism, would nod, confirming that it means it's working. The very act of respiration became a conscious effort, a shallow, restricted panting beneath layers of stiff fabric. Next, the farthingale, a voluminous hoop skirt, would be fastened around your waist, shaping your skirts into a magnificent, if unwieldy, bell tower. Over this layer upon layer of petticoats, a stiff bodice and a heavy overgown would follow. You didn't simply put on a dress, you assembled it like a siege weapon, each piece contributing to a formidable, if physically demanding, structure. The sheer physical burden was immense, the weight dragging at your shoulders, your arms restricted, unable to move freely or naturally. The entire point, you would realize, was to appear helpless, a desirable trait in a woman of your station, thus making you seem elegant. Any natural movement would be deemed unseemly, unladylike. Your hair, now considered court property, would be braided, pinned, or curled each day, according to the Queen's whim or the senior lady's dictates. It would be powdered with poorly dyed crushed flowers, which often left a chalky residue and an cloying, unnatural scent. You'd quickly learn to rely on your dishonest roommates for a quick whispered assessment of your appearance, knowing they might offer faint praise or cruel critiques depending on their mood or allegiances. Your makeup was a simple, stark affair, chalk for a fashionable pallor symbolizing status, and a life of leisure, and perhaps a touch of crushed beetle for a hint of red on your lips, though rouge was only permitted if it didn't make you appear common. Every inch of your being, from the stiff lace at your cuffs to the carefully pinned strands of your hair, became a part of this performance, one that never ends, one that no one claps for. The ultimate paradoxical goal was to be unnoticed at all. for in the Tudor court, invisibility was often the safest form of survival. After the intricate and often painful ritual of dressing, you would quickly become intimately familiar with another grim reality of court life, the profound absence of true cleanliness. Forget the soothing warmth of a modern bath, the invigorating lather of scented soap, or the simple luxury of fresh running water. In the Tudor court, such notions were for the most part entirely alien. No real soap existed as we understand it. Nothing to truly lift the grime and sweat of a day's forced activity from your skin. Your daily hygiene routine, if it could even be called that, consisted of little more than dabbing at your neck and wrists with a cloth moistened with rose water, or perhaps a sharp acidic vinegar. It was a fleeting, superficial attempt to mask rather than cleanse a mere whisper of freshness against the pervasive background of less pleasant aromas. Actual full-body bathing was not only considered indulgent, a decadent waste of precious resources and time, but also in a strange twist of logic, maybe even dangerous. The prevailing medical theories of the era posited that warm water had the unwelcome effect of opening the pores to disease. Imagine for a moment the sheer discomfort of this belief system. Your body, already encased in layers of restrictive clothing, would accumulate the day's exertions its natural musk. Yet the very act that might offer true relief was deemed a perilous invitation to illness. So instead of bathing, the strategy was one of elaborate concealment. You would, like everyone else, dedicate considerable effort to masking smells. This involved covering, perfuming, and layering scents, not only perfumes themselves, but also sachets of dried herbs tucked into sleeves or posies held close to the nose. It became a constant, almost unconscious act until your very being was enveloped in an armor woven from the cloying sweetness of stale roses, the sharp tang of sweat, and subtly but undeniably the faint lingering scent of old meat from the previous day's meals. Despite this collective effort to create a perfumed facade, a curious and rather cruel irony persisted the shared stench. Everyone, from the lowest scullery maid to the highest-ranking duke, carried some variation of this perfumed, slightly sour aura. Yet, individual judgment remained surprisingly, perhaps even viciously harsh. A stray stain on your gown, a telltale wrinkle in your linen shift, or the subtle dusting of dandruff on your shoulders. These seemingly minor imperfections would be noted, whispered about, and judged with an almost obsessive scrutiny. You quickly developed a quiet internal paranoia. Your eyes would instinctively dart to your collar, your hands constantly, almost unconsciously, checking your hems. A sudden pang of panic would seize you over an imaginary blemish, a smudge that wasn't there. Shame, that most insidious of emotions, began to settle in, becoming not just a feeling, but an instinct, a constant low-level thrum of anxiety beneath the velvet and lace. Contrast this with the queen, who always appeared miraculously immaculate. Her skin seemed to glow. Her gowns were pristine. Her hair perfectly coiffed. This illusion, of course, was carefully curated. The queen had a dedicated retinue of multiple attendants, not just for dressing and hair, but specifically for the meticulous care of her linens, for providing her with fresh shifts throughout the day, for whisking away anything that dared to show a wrinkle or a speck of dirt. Her proximity to true power afforded her luxuries you could only dream of. Her suffering in this realm of personal comfort might be a momentary pinprick during a fitting, a small, fleeting discomfort as a seam was adjusted or a new gown draped. Your suffering, by stark contrast, was the constant low-grade throb of discomfort bleeding through your stays, due to the endless friction, perhaps, or a rash from unwashed fabric, and all the while being told to smile anyway, to maintain the veneer of graceful composure. Her perfection was a testament to her station. Your struggles were simply a matter of your inconvenient reality. The court was a stage, and everyone, particularly the women, was a performer. And the performance of impeccable cleanliness, however superficial, was perhaps one of the most demanding. With your elaborate, uncomfortable costume now fully assembled, you would quickly fall into the relentless, unyielding rhythm of court life. Unlike the structured schedules we might imagine for a modern workplace, the Tudor court's daily routine didn't exist neatly printed on a parchment scroll. Instead, it was etched in the minds of the senior ladies and in the eyes of the chamberlain, an unspoken shifting code of conduct that dictated your every moment. Days stretched out long, repetitive, and utterly exhausting, a ceaseless demand on your physical and mental reserves. There was no concept of a break, no quiet moment to simply be. One of the most profound physical tolls was the constant standing. You would stand for hours beside doors, your back aching, your posture rigidly maintained. You would stand behind chairs often for entire meals, your feet swelling inside your tightly laced shoes. You would stand in endless lines, waiting, always waiting. Your feet accustomed to the soft turf of your family estate or the gentle give of carpeted floors would quickly go numb, a dull spreading ache transforming into a prickly oblivion. But shifting your weight, swaying even slightly, or heaven forbid, leaning against a wall, was strictly forbidden. Such movements betrayed a lack of discipline, a lapse in the carefully cultivated illusion of effortless grace. You were a living statue, poised and ever present, yet never truly at rest. The rare occasions when you were allowed to sit were not moments of genuine respite. These were ceremonial allowances, brief and precisely timed, always commanded directly by the Queen. You might be permitted to lower yourself onto a hard embroidered stool just long enough for the pins and needles to begin their torturous ascent up your legs before the Queen would shift or rise, and you would be expected to spring back to attention, ready to stand again. Your very presence, the sole purpose of your existence in these grand halls, was to create an atmosphere of attentive elegance and silent adoration. You were a living backdrop, a human tableau designed to reflect the Queen's magnificence, to silently affirm her power and desirability through your quiet, unwavering presence. Your individuality, that complex tapestry of thoughts, opinions, and personal history that made you you, was utterly suppressed. Your opinions were quite simply unwelcome. No one would ever consult you on matters of politics or the intricate theological debates that simmered beneath the surface of court life, or indeed on anything that might suggest you possessed an interior life beyond the immediate demands of your service. Your voice, when it was permitted to carry any weight at all, was restricted to the two pillars of female utility in this society, fashion and scandal. You might offer a delicate compliment on a new gown or subtly relay a piece of innocuous gossip that had already been thoroughly dissected by everyone else. In essence, you were furniture with facial expressions, required to nod politely to offer a soft manufactured laugh at stories you had heard 100 times over, and to perfect a soft smile, a delicate, almost imperceptible curve of the lips that concealed not genuine amusement, but a deep-seated awareness of intrusion and underlying threat. Any genuine emotion would be seen as a weakness, a dangerous deviation from your appointed role. The tedium, the sheer mind-numbing repetition of your days was a quiet torment. Embroidery was a constant companion, stitching until your fingers were blistered and raw, working for weeks on the same floral trim, the same intricate pattern for a gown that might ultimately be worn only a handful of times. Attending court visitors meant being part of the backdrop. expected to smile serenely, to listen attentively to conversations that held no genuine interest for you, and to speak softly, if at all, offering only carefully rehearsed praises for the queen or the king. The ultimate irony of your existence was that you were constantly visible, omnipresent, yet never truly seen. Everyone knew your name, but absolutely no one ever used it unless it was to summon you to issue a quiet command or to deliver a subtle reprimand. You were not meant to be memorable. You were instead an interchangeable part. If you were to disappear, to vanish from the endless parade of velvet and silk, someone else would by morning simply take your place, and no one will ask where you went. Your fate in this glittering cage was to be a temporary fixture, easily replaced, silently forgotten. Of all the paradoxical experiences within the Tudor court, few were quite as stark or as cruelly illustrative of your true position as the court feast. From the outside, it was a dazzling, overwhelming display of excess, a cornucopia of culinary spectacle designed to impress, to boast, to demonstrate the king's immeasurable wealth and power. Yet for you, a lady-in-waiting, these grand occasions were all abundance on the outside, all gnawing emptiness within. You were present, certainly, but only to assist and to observe, never ever to appear hungry. Hunger, you see, was considered unseemly, a base animalistic urge that had no place in the refined, ethereal world of courtly elegance. You were expected to project an image of effortless satiety, as if sustenance were a mere trifle beneath your delicate consideration. The hours leading up to such a feast were for you an exhausting prelude of relentless preparation. The queen herself, your mistress, had to be wrestled into her own elaborate finery, perhaps a gown heavier and more ornate than any you yourself would ever wear, adorned with pearls and jewels that seemed to weigh down the very fabric. This intricate process of lacing, pinning, and adjusting could take hours, leaving you physically drained and aching before the first course was even announced. By the time you finally entered the great hall, the air thick with the scent of roasting meats and expensive spices, your own stomach would likely be rumbling a discreet but persistent reminder of your impending starvation. And indeed, starvation, or at least the profound discomfort of it, was an invisible companion. You would stand, as always, for the entire duration of the feast, your feet throbbing beneath layers of unyielding fabric. Your stomach, a private, rebellious entity, would growl its protest, but your face remained serene, your posture impeccable. Starvation is invisible. You would remind yourself, a quiet mantra of endurance. Your role was to serve the queen, holding her napkin as she delicately dabbed at her lips, passing her goblet as she quenched her thirst, and always smiling politely as she ate, conversed, and laughed, seemingly oblivious to the silent suffering of those around her. You might even find yourself breathing through your mouth a subtle, almost unconscious effort to avoid the rich, greasy aromas that wafted from the platters, lest the scent itself trigger a wave of overwhelming hunger. The food itself, for those seated at the high table, was less about nourishment and more about pure spectacle. You would witness the arrival of whole roasted animals, perhaps reattached with their feathers, to create a bizarre, lifelike tableau. Eels might be shaped into mythical beasts, their serpentine forms woven into intricate, disturbing designs. It was a visual feast, a theatrical display designed to impress visiting dignitaries, to convey a message of unparalleled power and unlimited resources, rather than to simply provide a satisfying meal. Your own meal, should you be fortunate enough to receive one at all, would come hours later, if not in the dead of night, then certainly long after the main event had concluded. You would retreat to the servants' hall, a far less grand space where scraps dumped into uneven piles awaited. The meat, what little there was, would often be stringy or surprisingly undercooked, or perhaps most disturbingly suspiciously gray. The bread was usually the safest bet, a hard, dense loaf, though even that could be stale. The cheese was always a gamble, its texture and scent an unpredictable mystery. And the wine. It would likely taste as though it was stored in a boot, a sour, rough liquid that offered little comfort. You would quickly discern that food distribution at court was not merely about sustenance. It was a precise, immediate indicator of hierarchy. Your place in the pecking order was directly reflected in the quality and quantity of the morsels that eventually found their way to your plate. Hunger, you would come to understand, was also a tool wielded with quiet malice by kitchen stewards seeking to assert their petty authority, or by senior ladies with a grudge to bear. You might recall a time you spent 2 days on hard bread, alone, a silent punishment for an overheard innocent comment about someone's sleeves. Such was the subtle yet potent power dynamics of court life. The result of this erratic and often questionable diet was a constant undercurrent of physical discomfort, persistent stomach pain, weekly bouts of diarrhea, and an uncomfortable bloating that was a perpetual companion. The privies you would discover were perpetually overused and tragically undercleaned, their stench a constant reminder of the court's less glamorous realities. Vomiting during morning prayers is a common, almost unremarkable occurrence, often unremarked upon by those around you, simply absorbed into the background hum of court life. And yet, despite this miserable diet and the physical toll it exacted, you were still expected to maintain a specific, unattainable figure. Thin but not too thin, full but not indulgent, glowing but not ruddy. A perfect paradox. You would resort to your own small rituals for appearance, tightening your stays even further, pinching your cheeks for a fleeting flush of color, biting your lips to bring a deeper hue to their pale surface. You were forced to display gratitude for bruised pears, for even these meager offerings were a luxury to be thankful for, as complaining is for people with leverage, and you most decidedly had none. Your grand fantasies, those youthful dreams of splendor and delight, would quietly shrink until all you truly yearned for was simple, soft food. Hunger, you would realize with a quiet sigh, had not merely been an occasional discomfort. It had become part of the uniform. Having navigated the physical constraints and daily discomforts of your existence, you would soon confront the far more insidious and dangerous reality of court politics. This was not the polite, strategic game of chess one might imagine nobles playing in quiet chambers. No, court politics was for all intents and purposes a blood sport. And you, a young, often naive woman, were soft-bodied and unarmed in this arena. You were not a player, not even a spectator in any meaningful sense. Instead, you were merely a piece, a carefully placed pawn, positioned by others, maneuvered without consent, and sacrificed as needed. Your fate, your very person, was subject to the whims and grand strategies of forces far beyond your control or comprehension. The air itself seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension, a low hum of ambition, fear, and betrayal that was far more palpable than the grand tapestries on the walls. Your very presence in a room, your seat at a table, or even your proximity to a particular conversation could become a message, a subtle declaration of allegiance that you had no intention of sending and often no awareness of having sent. Imagine the quiet apprehension of being seated next to a Protestant sympathizer, known for their reformist leanings, when the Queen herself was at that moment leaning towards Catholic orthodoxy. Or finding yourself inadvertently placed directly between warring courtiers, two formidable figures locked in a silent, seething feud, their cold enmity radiating from them like a winter chill. Your innocent position, your polite smile could be misinterpreted as tacit approval, a signal of support for one faction over another, drawing you unwittingly into dangerous currents. You learned to constantly scan, to observe, to try and read the invisible lines of alliance and animosity that crisscrossed the glittering hall, a silent calculus of survival that became as essential as breathing. The court, you would quickly realize, was in a perpetual state of choosing sides. These factions were not always clear-cut, defined by simple labels. They shifted and blurred like smoke, sometimes religious in nature, sometimes purely political, often intensely personal, driven by a petty slight or a coveted position. The dizzying speed with which these allegiances could transform would leave you constantly off balance. You often wouldn't know which side you were on until it was quite suddenly too late. A quiet nod of agreement to one lady, a dismissive glance at another, a shared moment of laughter with a particular lord. Any of these could in the blink of an eye inadvertently align you with a faction that was about to fall, or worse, to be accused of heresy or treason. Neutrality, you would discover, was not an option. It was a comfortable fantasy for those safely ensconced outside the court's walls. Within this gilded cage, silence itself was interpreted often as a form of disloyalty, a dangerous lack of commitment. Why so quiet? The unspoken question would hang in the air. What are you hiding? Every single word you uttered, every fleeting expression that crossed your face, a slight flicker of boredom, a momentary tightening of the lips, a small widening of the eyes, was scrutinized, weighed, and judged. A wrong smile, perhaps one offered to someone who had recently fallen out of favor, or an accidental frown during a courtier's jest, could be taken as an insult, a criticism. And in this environment, such an error could lead to grave accusations, setting in motion a chain of events you could not possibly foresee, and certainly could not control. You lived in a constant state of quiet vigilance. Your senses heightened your mind, always assessing the subtle shifts in atmosphere. The air itself seemed to crackle with the energy of ambition and quiet menace. This was the true nature of court politics, not a grand strategy, but a series of microaggressions and silent battles fought with glances and whispers. You were a player without knowing the rules, a target without knowing the enemy. In the shadowy corridors of the Tudor court, truth was a malleable thing often less substantial than the whispers that defined it. Treason, you would quickly learn, was not a verifiable act, a tangible deed committed in the dead of night. No treason was chillingly a rumor. It began innocuously enough as a mere whisper, a fleeting breath of suspicion exchanged between two ladies-in-waiting, or perhaps a fleeting comment overheard from a disgruntled gentleman. Yet by the time supper was served, that whisper would have swelled fully formed and terrifyingly concrete into a damning accusation. The terrifying part was that it didn't even need to be true for it to cling to a person, to a reputation, to a life with the tenacious, suffocating grip of smoke. It would permeate every conversation, color every glance, and slowly, irrevocably taint your very being. A seemingly insignificant gesture could be your undoing. Imagine, if you will, a long, tedious evening filled with the king's often repeated predictable jests. Perhaps in a moment of unguarded weariness or genuine boredom, your eyes rolled ever so subtly, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, a silent commentary on the banality of courtly entertainment. That single fleeting expression, if caught by the wrong person, a jealous rival, a watchful attendant, or a courtier eager to curry favor by reporting perceived disloyalty, could lead to your quiet, unceremonious disappearance. The official explanation, of course, would be a polite euphemism, a vague reference to questionable loyalty, or perhaps an unannounced visit to a sick aunt. But you and everyone else who understood the true currency of the court would know the unspoken truth. You had been erased, exiled, or worse, simply for a flicker of honest emotion. Even your very person, your physical being, was not truly your own. It was rather a valuable asset, a bargaining chip in the intricate, often brutal negotiations of power. Your virginity, for instance, held immense political value. It was a commodity carefully guarded and strategically deployed, a potential prize in marriage alliances that could solidify family connections or secure advantageous positions. Your silence, too, was an asset, a precious commodity in the hushed, secretive world of marriage negotiations. A lady who knew how to keep her counsel to observe without comment was far more desirable than one prone to indiscretion, regardless of her beauty or family lineage. This quietude, this practiced discretion, was not merely a social grace. It was a strategic imperative, a sign that you could be trusted with the unspoken secrets of powerful families. Every single aspect of your existence, down to the very fabric of your gown, became symbolic, open to interpretation, and ultimately weaponized. If you chose to wear a more modest dress with a higher neckline and a conservative cut, it could align you, perhaps unwittingly, with a particular, more religiously conservative faction within the court. This was an era where clothing was not just fashion. It was a statement of belief, a declaration of loyalty, a visual marker of your alignment. Conversely, a slightly lower neckline, a more daring cut, could inadvertently position you with another more progressive or perhaps more morally lax group. Your hairstyle, the color of your ribbons, the choice of your jewelry, every single element of your carefully curated appearance was subject to intense scrutiny, interpreted as evidence of your allegiance, your character, your very soul. Your body, your clothes, your expressions, your silences. All became a public ledger, meticulously recorded and endlessly analyzed, the raw data for endless speculation and ultimately for judgment. You were a walking, breathing testament to the profound political weight of personal presentation, a silent semaphore in a world where every gesture carried meaning and every meaning could be twisted to your detriment. When the inevitable accusations finally flew, as they always did in that viper's nest of a court, you would quickly discover a terrifying truth. You were not afforded the luxury of defending yourself. There was no formal charge, no opportunity to speak on your own behalf, to argue your innocence, or to explain a misinterpreted glance. Instead, you were simply informed, quietly and indirectly. You might walk into a room and find your name being whispered, a sudden chilling chill settling in the air. Or perhaps you would return to your shared quarters to find your bed. Your meager belongings mysteriously moved, a silent signal that your place had been revoked. Your duties, previously a relentless burden, would simply be reassigned to another without explanation or farewell. The silence of your dismissal was often more terrifying than any shouted accusation. It left you no space to argue, no ground to stand upon, just a sudden cold vacuum where your life had been. The cruel paradox of court survival was that while standing out could be fatal, attempting to become utterly invisible didn't work either. Fading too far into the background, becoming too quiet, too unassuming, too much a part of the draperies, simply made you suspect. Why so quiet? The unspoken question would hang in the air, a silent accusation. What are you hiding? Your very attempt at self-preservation, at minimizing your presence, would be twisted into a sign of guilt, a dangerous secretiveness. You were trapped in an impossible bind too visible, and you risked drawing the queen's capricious displeasure or a rival's jealous eye. Too invisible, and you became a blank canvas upon which fears and suspicions could be projected. The constant mental gymnastics required to navigate this tightrope to appear just present enough but never too prominent was a draining, relentless exercise in psychological warfare. Even the ties that once defined you, the very connections that had brought you to court in the first place, could become a profound liability. Your own family, the source of your noble birth and social standing, could suddenly be perceived as a weakness, a connection that might implicate you in someone else's downfall. Imagine the quiet horror of being forced to distance yourself from the very people who loved you, to deliberately erase pieces of your identity, to sever those deep-rooted ties, simply to survive another day in the unpredictable currents of courtly power. The letters you used to write home might become shorter, more guarded, less personal. Your visits, if ever permitted, would become strained, filled with unspoken anxieties and a new, unsettling distance. You learned to live in a state of quiet disassociation, cutting off pieces of yourself, of your past, to fit the ever-changing, ever-demanding mold of courtly expectation. In this treacherous environment, you were rarely an active agent in your own destiny. Instead, you were a malleable object, a tool to be wielded in others' intricate, often ruthless games. One day you might be seen as a spy, inadvertently privy to a conversation that could be weaponized. The next, you might be maneuvered through no action of your own into the role of a seductress, drawing the attention of a powerful man as part of someone else's larger scheme. You could be subtly positioned as a devout Catholic, or conversely, a secret Protestant, depending on the shifting religious tides and who sought to gain from your perceived alignment. You were nothing more than a pawn of the Queen's faction, one moment, and then with a dizzying shift, a tool of her enemies, the next. This utter lack of control over your own narrative, over the very identity projected onto you by others, was a profound and deeply unsettling aspect of your daily life. Ultimately, there was no victory for you in this relentless political arena, no triumphant rise, no glorious accomplishment to be celebrated. The only ambition you could reasonably hold was the desperate hope of simply surviving, of remaining untouched by the endless machinations. Your deepest aspiration became to fade into the wallpaper, to blend into the furniture, to become so utterly unremarkable that you might simply be overlooked when the political storms raged through the court. To avoid the tower, to avoid exile, to avoid public disgrace. This was the quiet, terrifying aspiration of your existence. You became a connoisseur of anonymity, a master of blending in, knowing that your greatest protection lay in being forgotten. Within the elaborate tapestry of courtly life, your ultimate fate, you would discover, was inextricably tied to the most unpredictable and volatile force of all the Queen's moods. Her temperament, as capricious as the English weather, could shift without warning, offering no prior indication, no gentle prelude to the sudden realization that your precarious safety status had subtly yet profoundly changed. One day you might be a quiet fixture in her chambers, simply one of many. The next, a shadow might fall, an unspoken chill, and you would instinctively know deep in your gut that something had shifted, and your very existence was now balanced on an even sharper knife edge. There would be brief, tantalizing periods of favor moments when the Queen might unexpectedly crack a joke in your presence, or offer a fleeting compliment on your embroidery, or even bestow a small, seemingly insignificant gift. A ribbon, a small piece of fabric, a trinket. These instances were tempting, certainly a warm, ephemeral glow that momentarily banished the constant chill of anxiety. It was so easy, so desperately human to cling to these brief reprieves to allow yourself to believe they might last. But you would soon learn, perhaps through bitter experience or observing the silent downfalls of others, that believing they would endure was the worst mistake you could possibly make. Such favor was not a foundation upon which to build security. It was merely a temporary spotlight, bright and exhilarating in its moment, but leaving you exposed when it inevitably moved on. For the Queen's displeasure, when it settled, rarely announced itself with a grand fanfare. It simply found its resting place on whoever was nearest, often for the most arbitrary, unfathomable reasons. Perhaps she had slept poorly, or a message from the king had displeased her, or simply the morning light struck her in an unflattering way. Her rage, you would come to understand, was not a violent explosion of temper. Instead, it was slow and soft and cold, a creeping frost that subtly encased you. She wouldn't scream, wouldn't throw objects, wouldn't even raise her voice. She would simply begin to look through you, her gaze passing over you as if you were made of glass, or perhaps simply were not there at all. Her ladies-in-waiting, once a constant presence, would gradually notice she stopped asking for you by name. Your duties previously assigned with implicit understanding would be quietly, almost imperceptibly, reassigned to another younger, less tainted face. You would know when the summons is coming, when the axe was about to fall, not by a direct word, but by the myriad subtle cues that formed the silent language of the court. Other ladies, your supposed companions, would begin to avoid your eye, their gazes darting away as you approached, as if merely acknowledging your presence could infect them with your impending misfortune. Your name, once a regular fixture, would inexplicably disappear from the schedules for attendance or duties. Your seat at the Queen's table or within her private chamber would be moved subtly at first, then more overtly, further and further away from her person, a visual metaphor for your growing distance from her grace. The silence around you would become heavier, pregnant with unspoken meaning. It was vital to remember that the Queen herself, despite her immense power, was under constant, relentless scrutiny. She was surrounded by snakes and silks and swords wrapped in flattery, a perpetual performance of power and vulnerability. Her own authority was conditional, dependent on the king's favor, the health of a male heir, and the fragile stability of the kingdom. Often her lashing out, her sudden cold displeasure was the only tangible thing she can still truly control, the only outlet for her own anxieties and frustrations. And you, alas, were simply the nearest target, a convenient and expendable vessel for her deflected rage. Favorites shifted with dizzying speed. A compliment one day could morph into a damaging, negative health rumor spread by the Queen herself that very night, designed to subtly diminish a rival or discard an inconvenient attachment. Every time you entered a room, your eyes would instinctively dart to the Queen's face, a rapid internal assessment of her mood. You would adjust your tone, your expression, striving to be perfectly invisible, yet impeccably attentive. The comforting illusion that being indispensable offered any true protection was in this environment utterly false. Favor was not an armor. It was terrifyingly a spotlight, illuminating you not for your strengths, but for your weaknesses, making you a target for others. And others, there were jealous, petty enemies, those who coveted your position, or simply enjoyed the sport of quiet destruction. They would plant rumors, insidious little seeds of doubt, which would then grow with alarming speed into full-blown accusations once the Queen's mood soured or her gaze drifted away from you. Even if you meticulously did everything right, if you followed every unspoken rule, if you endured every indignity with a serene smile, you were never truly safe. Your fate always was tied to the queen's unpredictable whims, a constant low thrum of dread beneath the silk and jewels. In the close, often stifling confines of the Tudor court, where bodies were pressed against bodies in crowded halls and shared sleeping quarters, illness was not a distant threat, a vague possibility. No illness was a grim certainty, a when, not an if. It was simply an inevitable consequence of so many people living in such intimate, often unsanitary conditions. Imagine the constant recirculation of air, the shared breaths, the unseen passage of microscopic invaders from one person to the next. The court, with its grand pronouncements and its carefully constructed facade of divine order, pretended that health was a matter of virtue, a sign of God's favor, or perhaps simply good breeding. Yet beneath the velvet and lace it utterly stubbornly ignored contagion factors. No one truly understood how disease spread, preferring instead to attribute sickness to miasmas, imbalances of humors, or even moral failing. This meant that once a sickness took hold, it would sweep through the palace with a relentless democratic indifference, taking down noble and servant alike, often with startling speed. You would quickly learn to read the unspoken signs, the subtle, chilling shifts in the court's atmosphere that signaled the quiet approach of pestilence. It began with the seemingly innocuous details: a fainting maid in the antechamber, perhaps her pale face striking against her drab gown. Then you might notice the sudden unannounced vanishing of page boys, young energetic figures who simply ceased to appear at their accustomed posts. Or perhaps the subtle yellowing of a nobleman's skin, a pallor that spoke not of aristocratic delicacy, but of a deeper, more troubling internal struggle. The actual terrifying words like plague or sweating sickness were rarely, if ever, uttered aloud. To name the beast was in their superstitious minds to invite it. Instead, you learned to translate the euphemisms, the careful circumlocutions used to describe the ravages of disease. When a courtier was described as merely tired, you knew with a sinking certainty that they were likely wasting away from tuberculosis, its insidious cough a constant low background hum in the palace. If someone was unwell, it invariably meant a fever, perhaps a burning, uncontrollable heat that would soon engulf their body. And if someone was reported to have gone to visit family, especially if the visit was abrupt and unannounced, you understood with a quiet resignation that they were almost certainly dead. The polite fiction allowed the court to maintain its illusion of order and control even as its members vanished one by one into the cold earth. When illness did strike, and it would strike you, the remedies offered by the royal physicians were for the most part entirely useless. Imagine the grim irony, the most learned medical minds of the age offering guesswork wrapped in arcane terminology. Leeches applied to draw out bad blood would leave you weak and faint. Bleeding another popular panacea would deplete your already fragile strength. And the expensive syrups concocted from exotic herbs and dubious ingredients often did little more than purge your system, adding to your misery. You would likely be told to ingest powders made from crushed pearls, or drink strange concoctions of mercury and lead poisons offered as cures, all administered with an air of absolute certainty, despite their consistent failure. And crucially, there was no rest allowed. Even when feverish, your bones aching, your head throbbing with a persistent dull pain, you were still expected to rise, to dress, to don the layers of restrictive clothing, and to serve. Your physical suffering was secondary to your duty. You learned to hide your symptoms, to bite your tongue against the chattering of teeth, to steady your trembling hands, to force a serene smile onto a pallid face. Illness in the court marked you. It was a sign of weakness, a liability, and you would be quietly avoided your duties, subtly reassigned to healthier, more vigorous ladies. If God forbid you were to collapse to simply faint from exhaustion or fever, you would be swiftly and unceremoniously removed, not with concern, but with a quiet efficiency that prioritized the court's image, its carefully maintained illusion of perfection over your very body and well-being. Your person was secondary to your appearance, and your illness a threat to both. Beyond the generic fevers and stomach ailments, specific afflictions would leave their indelible marks on the court and on you. You would become adept at performing through lingering fevers, a low-grade heat that cooked your insides while you maintained an outward composure of perfect health. Imagine the effort biting your tongue literally to prevent the telltale chattering teeth from betraying your inner chill. Every step became a monumental effort. Every conversation a struggle to maintain focus. Your vision perhaps blurring at the edges. Your head throbbing with a dull, persistent ache that no amount of rose water could soothe. The fear of discovery, of revealing your weakness, was a far more potent motivator than any desire for rest. You would also bear quiet witness to the slow, agonizing decline of others from what was then simply called consumption, known today as tuberculosis. It was a disease that ravaged the court with a cruel, unhurried hand. You would watch helpless as once vibrant ladies became increasingly pale, their eyes growing hollow, their bodies wasting away, each cough a harsh rattling sound that seemed to tear at their very lungs. The blood-flecked handkerchiefs discreetly discarded were a grim common sight. The whispers would follow these individuals first, with pity, then with quiet dread, and finally with a hushed detachment, as they simply faded from the vibrant tapestry of court life, their last shallow breaths often taken in a cold, secluded room far from the Queen's sight. Then there was syphilis, the court's silent, festering epidemic. It was an unspoken truth, a disease whose presence was acknowledged only through euphemism and the telltale signs on its unfortunate victims. You would notice the increasingly thick makeup on certain faces, attempting to conceal the telltale sores and disfigurements. Gloves even indoors became a common accessory for those trying to hide the painful, unsightly lesions on their hands. It was a disease of profound hypocrisy. Highborn cases were quietly ignored, their indiscretions swept under expensive carpets, their symptoms dismissed as a touch of the pox, or simply an unfortunate humor. Yet if the disease manifested in the lower ranks in a servant or a minor courtier, it was instantly and harshly blamed on immoral behavior, a public condemnation that compounded their suffering with shame and social ostracization. The duality of judgment, one rule for the powerful, another for the powerless, was never more apparent than in the face of this insidious illness. And then there was smallpox, a terrifying specter that could erupt into a roaring court-wide panic. Unlike the slow burn of consumption or the hidden shame of syphilis, smallpox was undeniable, its effects brutally visible, its spread swift and terrifying. When it struck, the court would splinter its members, fleeing to their country estates in a desperate, often futile attempt to escape its grasp. Those who survived would return, marked, their faces pitted and scarred, a permanent testament to their ordeal. But even survival offered little comfort. Many who bore the scars of smallpox would simply disappear anyway, deemed too unsightly for court, too constant a reminder of death's proximity, and quietly dispatched to the countryside or a life of obscurity. Their scarred faces served as a chilling, living memento mori. In a desperate attempt at prevention, people clung to superstitious attempts, charming trinkets worn close to the skin, small bags of potent herbs tucked into their pockets, or the ritualistic dabbing of vinegar behind the ears. These practices, of course, offered no real protection against the invisible contagions. Their only true benefit was providing a comforting feeling of doing something, a small measure of control in a world governed by unpredictable and terrifying illnesses. But the underlying reality was grim. Your illness, should you succumb, would instantly suggest weakness in the Queen's household. It implied a flaw, a vulnerability, a crack in the pristine facade of her court. You would quickly become a liability, and in the ruthless calculus of Tudor power, liabilities don't last long. Your very existence, once an asset, would transform into a burden, and a sick lady-in-waiting was nothing more than an inconvenient problem to be quietly, efficiently removed. You were a tool, and a broken tool had no place in the Queen's delicate machinery. Within the glittering yet deeply treacherous labyrinth of the Tudor court, even the most tender and human of emotions like love could morph into a profound and deadly peril. What was on the surface celebrated as courtly love, a delicate dance of poetry, chivalry, and whispered admiration, was in truth a far more dangerous performance. It was less like poetry and more like a loaded crossbow, deceptively delicate in its appearance, perhaps adorned with silken ribbons and carved with intricate designs, but undeniably deadly in its practice. The arrow once loosed could pierce not just a heart, but a reputation, a family, and ultimately a life. To feel genuine affection, or to be the object of it, was to step onto ground riddled with hidden mines, each step fraught with the potential for catastrophic explosion. Imagine for a moment the quiet thrill, perhaps the fleeting innocent delight of catching a courtier's eye. A smile held a moment too long, a shared glance across a crowded hall, a seemingly casual conversation that lingered, a hand accidentally brushing yours in passing. These small gestures, so trivial in another setting, became fraught with immense danger within the confines of the court. For if such attention, even if entirely innocent on your part, was noticed by the Queen, you would feel almost immediately the ground crack beneath you. It was a sudden chilling shift in the very air, a quiet tremor that signaled an impending catastrophe. The Queen, ever watchful, ever jealous of any light that did not emanate directly from her, viewed any deviation of attention as a personal slight, a challenge to her unparalleled supremacy, a betrayal of your primary loyalty. In this environment where suspicions bloomed like poisonous nightshade, your guilt was assumed with a chilling swiftness. Your innocence, no matter how genuine, was utterly irrelevant. The intricate web of courtly etiquette and political maneuvering meant that the perception was the reality. If the Queen, in her often fragile state of mind, sensed you were drawing attention away from her, if she detected even a flicker of admiration directed elsewhere, then the judgment was passed. It mattered not if the courtier was merely being polite, or if your own intentions were pure. The very act of being seen by another in a way that hinted at even a casual intimacy was enough to condemn you. You became in her eyes a rival, a threat, a minor inconvenience that could quickly escalate into a major problem. The Queen's retaliation, should she deem it necessary, would rarely be a public outburst, a screaming fit that would draw unwanted attention. Instead, it would be subtle, insidious, and exquisitely, surgically cruel. She might begin by simply distancing herself from you, a slow, imperceptible withdrawal of her favor. You would no longer be summoned to her private chambers for dressing your name omitted from the daily roster. Her smiles, once bestowed, would now be reserved for others. Or, far more painfully, her retaliation could manifest as public comments, seemingly innocent remarks dropped in conversation, yet laced with a devastating undertone. Perhaps a comment on your pallor or a subtle observation about your lack of skill at a particular game designed to diminish your standing in the eyes of others to mark you as flawed. Or perhaps, most devastatingly, a quiet, unceremonious reassignment of your duties, moving you from the intimate circle of her personal attendants to a more distant, less prestigious role. A public demotion that silently screamed your disgrace to the entire court. These were not mere reprimands. They were public degradations designed to isolate you, to strip you of your status, and to serve as a chilling warning to anyone else who might dare to shine too brightly. If the casual admiration of a courtier was dangerous, then a genuine reciprocal affection, a true spark of feeling, was a hazard of an entirely different magnitude. If a courtier truly foolishly fell for you, if he dared to write you letters, their sentiments heartfelt and perhaps even beautifully phrased, or if he allowed his hand to linger ever so slightly on yours during a promenade, you were in truly profound trouble. This was not a mere flirtation easily dismissed. This was a direct, undeniable challenge to the Queen's supreme position as the sun around which all other bodies rotated. Her discovery of such a connection meant you were no longer just a temporary distraction, a fleeting annoyance. You became instantly and irrevocably a threat, a genuine bond. A relationship forged outside her control was an act of defiance, a subtle undermining of her power over her own court, and indeed, over her own women. The consequences of such a discovery were swift and brutal, though often conducted with a chilling formal politeness. Interrogation would follow, not a grand dramatic inquisition, but a quiet probing line of questioning designed to break your spirit and extract confessions, whether true or not. You would be called into a private chamber, perhaps with a stern, unyielding senior lady or a watchful chamberlain, their eyes cold and assessing. The questions would circle, probing your associations, your conversations, the very thoughts in your head. Your body, every curve and contour, every perceived flaw, would be discussed by powerful men as if they were butchers examining meat, coldly, clinically devoid of any humanity. Your virtue, your honor, your very essence would be dissected, speculated upon, and utterly stripped bare, not just for your own ears, but for the quiet judgment of the entire court. The shame of such an examination, the feeling of being utterly objectified, would sear itself into your memory, a silent scar that no amount of velvet could ever conceal. Once you were dropped like a disease, as if your very touch carried contagion, a quiet, unceremonious removal from your duties would ensue. If you were particularly fortunate, and if your family held enough influence, or perhaps if a convenient marriage could be arranged, you might be married off to someone irrelevant. This was not a love match, not a joyous union. This was a disposal, a strategic maneuver to remove you from the court's volatile ecosystem. Your husband might be a cousin with debts, a minor nobleman in need of a dowry, someone whose fortunes could be salvaged by such a union. Or perhaps a minor noble with a limp and 5 children, a man whose lack of ambition or social standing ensured you would never again pose a threat to anyone. This marriage, a bitter irony given your romantic transgressions, served multiple purposes. It removed you from court, satisfying the appearances of propriety, and ensuring your future is tied to a man who will subtly or overtly never let you forget your diminished value, your perceived fall from grace. Your life, once lived at the heart of power, would now be relegated to a quiet, often impoverished obscurity. And then the ultimate consequence, often inextricably linked to the hurried, ill-suited marriage's childbirth. This was a danger that loomed over every woman of the era, a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and death. The act of bringing new life into the world was filled with immense risk, a terrifying ordeal often conducted in drafty, unsanitary chambers attended by unwashed midwives. Prayers would be murmured, candles lit, and often, all too often, the outcome was not new life, but death for mother or child, or both. For a woman like you, newly married off in disgrace, this private suffering, this profound physical trial, would often take place far from the glittering court, hidden from the judging eyes that had once scrutinized your every move. It was a cruel, silent echo of the public humiliation that had preceded it, a final, definitive removal from the stage of courtly life, leaving you to face your mortality in quiet isolation. If a quiet, ill-advised affection was a loaded crossbow, then the physical manifestation of that affection, a swollen belly where none should be, was nothing short of a cannonball utterly undeniable, utterly destructive. This was the ultimate inescapable proof that something happened, something physical, something shameful, a visible betrayal of the strict moral codes and the precarious purity expected of a lady-in-waiting. Unlike whispers or glances, a pregnancy was a truth etched onto your very body, a truth that grew larger and more insistent with each passing month, impossible to hide, impossible to deny even in a court adept at turning a blind eye to inconvenient realities. It was, in essence, enough to end your life as you know it irrevocably. There was no secret path, no clever maneuver, no amount of strategic silence that could possibly avert the ruin that would inevitably follow. Your innocence, if indeed you possessed it in the eyes of God or man, was utterly irrelevant in this context. The court, in its cold, pragmatic judgment, cared not for the nuances of your heart or the circumstances of your vulnerability. Guilt was not determined by intent or consent. It was measured in months in the undeniable expansion of your waistline, a public calendar marking your disgrace. The fear you would discover was not merely of the initial discovery, that chilling moment when your secret was exposed. No, the deeper, far more pervasive terror was of the inevitable aftermath, the slow, systematic dismantling of your life piece by agonizing piece that would certainly follow. When the truth became undeniable, when the whispers solidified into certainty, you would be questioned. Not in a gentle, understanding manner, but with a probing, relentless interrogation designed not to ascertain truth, but to confirm guilt and extract details for the court's own machinations. Your body, the very vessel of your perceived shame, would be openly discussed by powerful men, men whose faces were impassive, whose voices were cold, dissecting your private life with the detached precision of scholars analyzing a text. They would speak of your condition and your misconduct as if you were an object, not a human being, your worth reduced to a moral transgression. Your name, once perhaps whispered with a hint of admiration or envy, would now be passed like a curse through the court, a cautionary tale, a mark of impurity that no amount of rose water could ever wash away. Exile, often presented as a merciful solution, would be your unavoidable fate. Sometimes it was formal, a polite official dismissal under the pretext of ill health, a convenient fiction that allowed the court to maintain its pristine image. You would be escorted away, your belongings swiftly packed, a quiet carriage waiting to take you far from the gilded halls. Other times the exile was informal, a slower, more insidious removal. You would simply begin disappearing from your duties, your presence no longer required. Your meals, once taken in the bustling servants' hall, would be quietly moved to a secluded room, a deliberate isolation designed to make you an unseen, unheard entity. The court would simply absorb your absence, carrying on as if you had never been there, erasing you from its collective memory before you had even truly left. And any child born of this illicit union would certainly be taken from you. There would be no tender moments, no opportunity to embrace your infant. It would be swiftly and quietly hidden, whisked away into the night, its fate often forever unknown to you. A wet nurse in a distant village, a quiet adoption by a minor family, the specifics rarely mattered. The child was a liability, a living testament to scandal, and its very existence had to be obliterated from courtly record. For you, the mother, this pregnancy is not a beginning but an end to your life at court, an end to your dreams, an end to your unblemished reputation. Even if by some extraordinary turn of fate or political machination you were ever permitted to return to court, you would forever be watched, judged, and inextricably marked as the one who fell. Your past would cling to you like a shroud, a constant unspoken reminder that you had dared to transgress to be human in a place that demanded nothing less than immaculate, inhuman perfection. In a world where every smile was a calculated risk and every whisper a potential weapon, your personal ruin, as we've discussed, was an ever-present shadow. But even beyond your own immediate perils, a far greater, more terrifying shift could begin to unfold, a seismic tremor within the very foundations of the court. For you, as a lady-in-waiting, your fate, your precarious survival was intrinsically bound not just to your own conduct, but to the ebb and flow of the Queen's power. You were a minor satellite in her orbit, and when her sun began to dim, you felt the chill almost immediately. The Queen's radiance, that almost blinding glow of favor and authority that had once enveloped her, could with astonishing speed begin to vanish quickly. It was rarely a sudden dramatic implosion, but a gradual insidious fading like sunlight slowly receding from a grand hall. You would begin to sense a subtle chill in the air, not merely the physical cold of the stone palace, but a pervasive emotional frigidity that settled over the Queen's chambers, extending its icy tendrils into the very fabric of courtly life. The vibrant hum of conversation would quiet, replaced by furtive whispers. Hushed tones, exchanged behind cupped hands, their content almost always concerning the Queen's declining standing. Courtiers who once flocked to her side, vying for a moment of her attention, would now find sudden pressing engagements elsewhere. Their eyes would subtly avoid hers, their steps quickening as they passed her, as if proximity itself carried a contagion of misfortune. The most potent and chilling indicator of this decline was, of course, the King's shifting attention. You would begin to notice his public interest in another woman, a new face in the court, perhaps younger, or simply more strategically pliable. His gaze, once fixed on the Queen, would now linger elsewhere, a subtle but devastating betrayal that every eye in the court would register. The light that had illuminated the Queen now began to shine on another, leaving her, and by extension, you in deepening shadow. The ripple effect was immediate and profound. Where once there was a steady stream of visitors to the Queen's presence chamber, now there would be an almost imperceptible thinning of the crowd, the flow of petitioners redirecting towards the King's newest favor. The Queen's own demeanor, a constant barometer for the court's mood, would shift in unsettling ways. She would become less talkative, her once lively conversations replaced by long, strained silences. The tinkling laughter that had occasionally escaped her lips would be replaced by a tightly controlled smile, or simply a somber stillness. The very routines that had once defined her days, the gentle walks through the palace gardens, The evenings spent listening to music or engaging in playful banter would begin to be canceled. Excuses would be vague, delivered by weary attendants, but the message was clear: her world was contracting, shrinking under an unseen pressure. You would witness her flinching at sudden noises or at the approach of a courtier, a subtle, almost involuntary withdrawal indicative of a mind stretched taut with anxiety. Her appearance, once meticulously coiffed and vibrant, would reflect her inner turmoil. Her hair perhaps would be styled with a severe simplicity, losing the soft curls and elaborate adornments that had once framed her face. Her gowns, previously chosen for their richness and color, might become darker, heavier, reflecting a somber internal landscape. Perhaps most heartbreakingly, you might observe her refusing her mirror. For a queen whose image was so intrinsically linked to her power and her public persona, this was a profound act of self-rejection. The mirror, once a tool for perfection, would become a painful reflection of her fading influence, a silent judgment that she could no longer bear to confront. You watching from the periphery, your own life inextricably tied to hers, would feel a cold dread creep into your bones. You understood with a chilling certainty that her decline was your decline, and her quiet undoing would inevitably lead to your own. The very air around you would feel thick with unspoken fears, the beautiful tapestries and gilded ceilings becoming a grand, suffocating stage for an unfolding tragedy. As an integral part of her household, inextricably linked to her person, you were in essence her shadow. And just as a shadow disappears when the light source dims, you understood with a cold certainty that seeped into your bones that you cannot escape untouched when she falls. Your proximity to the queen, once a source of subtle prestige and potential advancement, now became your greatest liability, a brand that marked you as part of her increasingly dangerous orbit. You were no longer merely a lady-in-waiting. You were her lady-in-waiting, a silent testament to her past glory, and thus a casualty of her present decline. The quiet, almost imperceptible process of your own undoing would begin. Your name, that simple identifier, would now appear in ledgers under chilling new classifications: suspected, perhaps if you had been seen too often at her side or too readily laughed at her jests; or loyalist, a term that sounded honorable but carried a death knell in a shifting court, for loyalty to a falling star was a dangerous, often fatal attachment. Worst of all, perhaps, was replaceable, a cold, bureaucratic acknowledgement of your utter disposability, a quiet declaration that your specific skills and presence were no longer desired or even tolerated. Suddenly, those who had once sought your company, who had shared whispered secrets and polite pleasantries, would begin to avoid you. Their eyes would dart away when you approached, their conversations would abruptly cease, replaced by a strained, unnatural silence. Friends, or those you had considered as such, would find sudden urgent tasks elsewhere, their backs turning to you with an almost tangible chill. You would feel yourself becoming a pariah, a quiet contagion shunned not for your own actions, but for the company you kept. Your duties, the mundane tasks that had once filled your endless days, would be quietly, efficiently reassigned to others, leaving you with an unsettling abundance of idle time, a dangerous vacuum in which to contemplate your precarious future. The queen's physical and emotional decline, observed intimately from your close vantage point, would become palpable, a suffocating weight that pressed down on the entire household. More servants would vanish, their absences noted only in the quiet reorganizations of tasks. The grand rooms, once alive with the rustle of silks and the murmur of conversation, would now be filled with an oppressive silence, a chilling quietude that seemed to absorb every sound, every breath. This silence was worse than any screaming, for it spoke of an unseen power at work, a quiet, inexorable force that was dismantling the Queen's world piece by agonizing peace. You would witness her, once vibrant eyes grow hollow, her posture subtly slump, her voice lose its former command, replaced by a brittle, almost desperate tone. Every strained smile, every nervous flicker of her gaze was a testament to the mounting pressure that threatened to crush her and you along with her. And so sleepless nights became your constant companion. You would lie awake on your uncomfortable bed listening, always listening for the sound of footsteps in the corridor, those heavy, purposeful steps that meant official business, that signaled an arrest, a summons to the tower. Your stomach, already accustomed to the pangs of hunger, would now gnaw with a new, sharper pain of anxiety. Eating became a chore food, a tasteless burden, your throat too tight with fear to swallow. Closing your eyes offered no respite, for sleep would not come, and you knew with a horrifying certainty that's how it always happens in the night. The silent, unseen approach of doom under the cloak of darkness. The image of the tower, that grim, foreboding fortress by the Thames, would loom large in your mind, its very name conjuring an echo of chains, the rank scent of stone and fear. You would imagine its cold, damp cells, the endless gray walls, the terrifying finality of its gates. Even the Queen, in her moments of desperate clarity, might offer a chilling final warning. They're watching, don't speak to anyone you don't trust. A stark instruction in a place where trust was a luxury you could no longer afford. Even your closest companions, those who had once shared your chamber and your quiet anxieties, would begin to pull away, their loyalty to the Queen dissolving under the harsh light of self-preservation. For the Queen, you would realize, was nothing more than a sinking ship, and everyone, every last soul, was now desperately rowing toward shore, abandoning her to her inevitable, terrifying fate. And you, still on board, felt the water rising around your feet. The quiet dread that had permeated the Queen's chambers would inevitably give way to stark, brutal reality. The charges would come suddenly, often in the dead of night, shattering any lingering illusion of safety. They were rarely specific, rarely confined to a single provable transgression. Instead, they were a terrifying grab bag of accusations thrown out with a ruthless abandon, treason, the gravest of all, designed to shatter reputations and justify the harshest penalties. Adultery, a moral condemnation that could ruin a woman entirely. Perhaps even sorcery, a catch-all accusation that could be leveled against anyone perceived as a threat, a dark, superstitious charge to condemn the innocent. It was, whatever fits, whatever will stick, whatever could be twisted and shaped to achieve the desired outcome, the removal and often the destruction of the Queen and all those associated with her. You, caught in her collapsing orbit, would be questioned, not in a formal, legalistic manner, but by men who would appear friendly, their voices deceptively calm, their smiles polite, their questions subtly probing, designed to ensnare you in contradictions, to extract confessions, to draw out any shred of information that could be used against the Queen or against you. Your fear, by this point, would have become a physical entity, a chemical reaction that flooded your system, making your heart pound and your limbs tremble. Your body, already exhausted by months of anxiety and deprivation, would begin to shut down your mind, struggling to form coherent thoughts, to recall facts, to find the right, safe answers. The goal was not justice, but a quiet, efficient dismantling of your will. In those terrifying moments, your only viable strategy, your desperate gamble for survival, was to vanish in place. It was an almost spiritual exercise in self-effacement to become so utterly unremarkable, so devoid of personality or strong opinion, that no one would remember your involvement, no one would deem you important enough to pursue. You would strive to become a blank slate, a forgotten face in the background, a silent, obedient shadow. This was your frantic preparation for an escape that has nowhere to go. A psychological retreat into anonymity when physical flight was impossible. You would practice your impassive expression, your quiet nods, your utterly neutral responses, praying that they would render you invisible, a non-entity in the eyes of your interrogators. When the queen was finally abruptly removed, the silence that descended upon the court would be worse than any screaming. It was a profound, unnatural stillness, a vacuum created by the sudden absence of so much power and presence. The customary sounds of court life, the rustle of gowns, the murmur of conversation, the faint strains of music would continue, but they would feel hollow, empty, imbued with a chilling undercurrent of terror and forced normalcy. The court, with its relentless self-preserving inertia, would simply carry on as if nothing truly catastrophic had occurred. And the king, with an almost obscene speed, would be seen smiling at someone new. His attention already pivoted, his affections already re-engaged, a brutal demonstration of the fleeting nature of power and the expendability of even a queen. You and all the others who had served the fallen queen would be expected to show no grief, no hesitation, no trace of loyalty. Any outward sign of sorrow or allegiance would be a dangerous, possibly fatal act of defiance. You would watch impassively as the new lady stepped into the queen's chambers, as new duties were assigned, as the court silently adjusted to its new reality. Your closeness to power, that glittering lure that had drawn you to court in the first place, had ironically made you utterly disposable. You had been too near the flame, and now, even if you survived, you would never truly rise again. The mark of association would forever cling to you, an invisible stain on your reputation. You would learn to live with the fear not as a sudden sharp panic, but as a dull ache in your bones, a constant low-level thrum of anxiety that would accompany your every step. You would walk carefully, speak less, and acknowledge new queens with a tightened throat, a silent internal acknowledgement of the cyclical, brutal nature of courtly power. Your survival was simply a matter of enduring, of fading, of forgetting the girl you once were. If by some extraordinary stroke of luck, or perhaps through a combination of calculated anonymity and sheer fortitude, you were to survive the tempestuous tides of the Tudor court, you would eventually leave court changed. This departure would not be a triumph, no joyous homecoming, but rather a quiet, often unceremonious escape from a gilded cage. Your health would likely be broken, the years of inadequate nutrition, constant stress, and relentless physical demands having taken their irreversible toll. Your reputation, no matter how carefully guarded, would remain delicate, forever tainted by association, by the whispers and judgments that clung to anyone who had served a fallen queen. Yet amidst all this, your head would miraculously still be attached, a silent, grim victory in a place where heads were often removed with chilling regularity. This was survival, not success. There would be no honors, no grand ceremony to mark your departure. You would be dismissed quietly, perhaps under the convenient pretext of ill health, a face-saving excuse for the court, or the equally convenient arrangement of a hurried, unannounced marriage. Your possessions, meager as they might be, would be packed by others, your departure handled with a detached efficiency that underscored your diminished importance. A polite, perhaps slightly distant nod from a senior lady would be your only farewell from the court itself, and perhaps a brief unsigned letter from the Queen, a perfunctory note of dismissal that felt colder than any direct reprimand, a final impersonal severing of ties. The air you breathed outside the palace walls would feel different, perhaps sharper, certainly less perfumed but tinged with a strange unfamiliar freedom. Your post-court life, if you were among the fortunate few, would be a dimmed future, a quiet existence, far from the glittering center of power. If you were truly lucky, you would be married off to someone distant, dull, and politically harmless. This was not a romance, not a partnership, but a strategic placement, a quiet exile to a modest estate, perhaps with a husband who possessed bad breath and an irritating habit of leaving damp books on every surface. Your life would be defined by tolerable rather than happy moments, fulfilling your marital duties in the quiet darkness, your mind often elsewhere, drifting back to the cold splendor of the court, to the faces of those who had fallen to the silent anxieties that had once been your daily companions. The omnipresent danger of childbirth, a shadow over every woman's life in this era, would remain. You would carry with you the quiet awareness of the possibility of dying in childbirth, a fate shared by countless women whose bodies simply gave out like every other woman they've buried in that same patch of earth, in the small, unremarkable churchyard of your new quiet life. Your dreams, once grand and ambitious, would shrink to the simple aspiration of surviving the next confinement, of perhaps raising a few healthy children, of simply existing without further upheaval. But what if you were too ruined for even a politically convenient marriage? What if your reputation was irrevocably shattered, your health too frail, your family too compromised? Then your fate might be a stiff welcome at your family's house, a home that no longer felt like yours, filled with polite but constant reminders of a more successful sister, a brother who had made a better match. You would be given a small room, perhaps tucked away at the back of the house, a quiet, forgotten corner for an inconvenient relative. Or for women of noble birth deemed unmarriageable or too scandalous, there was the convent, a quiet, cold place, specifically for inconvenient women. There you would spend your days in prayer and fasting and endless scrubbing, the rigid routines slowly, deliberately forcing you to forget your name, to shed the identity that had brought you so much quiet suffering. But for many, perhaps the most likely outcome was simply to fade. Not with public disgrace, not with the martyrdom of a grand execution, but with a quiet, unremarked disappearance. You would simply be gone, your absence noted by few, mourned by even fewer. Your name might be misspelled in records, if it was recorded at all, a testament to your utter insignificance. Any letters you had written, any small tokens of your existence would be burned, erasing your fleeting presence from the historical record. Your story, your quiet endurance, your unseen suffering would remain utterly untold, swallowed by the relentless tide of history. This anonymity, you might even come to realize, was a kind of mercy. For in a world where suffering was often public spectacle, where a life could be immortalized through the very brutality of its end, it was better to be forgotten than immortalized for your suffering. Better to be a blank space in the annals of history than to have your pain meticulously documented, dissected, and remembered. The quiet oblivion offered a final profound peace, a release from the constant scrutinizing gaze of the court. Yet even in this quiet obscurity, you would forever, carry the memories. They would cling to you like a stubborn scent woven into the fabric of your being. The vibrant colors of gowns, the sour taste of old wine during feasts where you secretly hungered, the terrifying silence after screams that marked a disappearance, the faces of disappearing women, their fate unknown but grimly understood. You would recall the forced laughter, the constant demanding performance of politeness, the dizzying speed with which vanishing favor could alter a life, the settling constant fear that had been your most intimate companion. These memories would be less a narrative and more a collection of sharp sensory impressions, a series of visceral reminders of a life once lived on a razor's edge. An ache would linger for the naive girl who first walked in, that innocent, hopeful version of yourself who had arrived at court years ago brimming with quiet optimism. That girl you would realize had not truly survived. Instead, she had been carved away one smile at a time, one sleepless night after another. Each forced laugh, each moment of physical discomfort endured in silence. Each political maneuver navigated with exquisite caution had chipped away at her essence, slowly transforming her into the woman you had become. Even years later, seemingly innocuous sensory triggers would bring it all rushing back. The delicate feel of silk against your skin might conjure images of elaborate gowns and restrictive stays. The faint echo of a song heard in a distant manor house might transport you back to the court's glittering balls, where every dance was a performance of calculated charm. The cloying scent of rose water, once a desperate attempt to mask the pervasive odors of the palace, would instantly bring back the phantom smells of sweat, fear, and unwashed bodies. These memories, these quiet, insistent ghosts of your past, would be impossible to explain to others, to those who saw the court through the romanticized lens of ballads and tapestries, who could never comprehend the grim truth of it. For them, the court was a place of splendor, of grand romance and chivalry. For you, it was a life lived in velvet and silence, surrounded by jewels you could never own and people you could never trust. It was a world where your worth, your very existence, was measured in inches, the circumference of your tightly laced waist, the precise distance you maintained from the queen, the minute adjustments to your smile. It was a life of quiet terror, of constant vigilance, of profound physical and emotional deprivation, all hidden beneath a shimmering veneer of elegance. But now, as you close your eyes, you can find solace in a simple, profound truth. You're safe now. You're no one. And no one is exactly what they can't destroy. Now, gently, let that intricate tapestry of the past begin to unravel, softening at the edges, dissolving into the quiet comfort of your present moment. The gilded cages, the whispered fears, the constant demand for an impossible perfection. Let them recede, becoming distant echoes in the vast halls of history. You are not there standing silently in the cold, cavernous palace. You are here nestled in the warmth and safety of your own space. Feel the softness of your blankets, perhaps the reassuring weight of your pillow, a world away from hard shared beds and pervasive drafts. There are no critical eyes watching your every breath, no unspoken rules to decipher in the dark. The anxieties of that demanding court, the struggle for a fleeting meal, the relentless pursuit of an elusive cleanliness, all belong to another time, to lives long since lived and folded back into the earth. Let those lingering images of past hardships simply fade like the last embers of a dying fire, leaving behind only the gentle warmth of peace. As the quietude deepens, allow your mind to drift further from the echoes of Tudor court life. The only demands now are the gentle pull of gravity and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath. You are safe, you are warm, and the simple, profound comforts of your modern world embrace you fully. There are no more performances to give, no more smiles to force, no more fears to hide. Just quiet stillness and the promise of a restful night. Sweet dreams, and may your slumber be deep and undisturbed.